All right, welcome back to the Reinhart Labor and Employment Minute. I'm Rob Driscoll. Today, we are getting back to basics and discussing documentation of issues in the workplace. I'm pleased to be joined by my partner, Katie Triska. Katie has a lot of experience with documentation and spends much of her time helping with employers on this very issue. So Katie, I think that most people in HR hear from attorneys like us how documenting workplace issues, performance, conduct, etc., is really important. Can improve performance, ensure fairness, and also, as lawyers, we like to say it helps protect against liability for discrimination claims. But sometimes, as you know, executing that can be a lot harder than it seems. So, what kinds of things should employers document, and who should be doing the actual documentation?
Thanks, Rob. At a minimum, employers should be documenting performance reviews, violations of company policy, attendance issues, poor performance, any demotions or promotions, changes in job duties, and information regarding bonus and merit increase decisions. With respect to your question of who should complete the documentation, usually this documentation should be completed by an employee's immediate supervisor. A supervisor statement detailing her observations of an employee's misconduct, for example, is more valuable than a personnel manager's summary of the events as told to them. While it may still be appropriate for HR to review the documentation before it is presented to the employee or placed in their personnel file, we still want the documentation to reflect the supervisor's observations.
So along those lines, when the supervisor is preparing the documentation or maybe HR is reviewing it, are there any best practices that you recommend for what should actually be in the documentation itself?
Yes. I recommend that the documentation address the who, what, when, where, and why, especially for disciplinary notices. The names of individuals involved and witnesses to the event should be identified. The documentation should also provide the date of the incident and the date that the report was made. Employers should be careful that they're not backdating their documentation. If for some reason the documentation was not timely prepared, for example, maybe the HR manager was on vacation, still provide the correct date, but then include an explanation as to why there was a delay in documenting the incident. If prior or verbal warnings have been given to this employee for similar reasons, those should be detailed in the documentation as well. Lastly, the documentation should outline the expectations for the employee going forward and the consequences for noncompliance.
Now you mentioned, the backdating issue, something not to do. Are there any other kinds of things that should then not be in documentation, things to avoid putting in documentation when preparing it?
Yes, in preparing reviews or corrective action, employers should be careful to eliminate any non-job related comments and references to medical issues. Instead, employers should focus on the facts that were considered by the company and that are relevant to any disciplinary decisions. Employers should also be prompt in documenting performance issues and raising performance concerns with employees. They shouldn't wait until the problem gets out of hand to address the issue with the employee. In addition, employers should avoid using language that's specific to their company or to their industry that outsiders wouldn't understand. And don't assume facts that the reader maybe wouldn't know. You want to draft the disciplinary notice and the documentation such that a judge or a jury or an investigator could read the documentation and understand exactly what the issue is and why it's a problem.
Great. Yeah. So I guess, maybe to sum up your advice is put yourself in the shoes of someone else who may be reviewing the documentation later. Can that person understand what would happen or what happened from what you've written? So thanks, Katie, for your insight today. And thank you to our audience for joining us again.
Thank you.